Isla Bennett, a young woman struggling with poverty, was forced into a marriage contract with the cold and powerful Damien Cross. What started as a mere agreement slowly turned into something deeper, as love quietly found its way into their hearts. But when the contract ended, would they truly be able to stay together? If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like, share it with your friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories. The small apartment in the impoverished west side of New York was cold and cramped. Peeling paint covered the walls, and an old wooden table was cluttered with overdue bills. A heavy sense of despair filled the air. Isla Bennett, 24, sat beside her mother's bed, her slender fingers gently holding onto her mother's frail hand. Margaret Bennett, suffering from end-stage heart disease, needed urgent surgery. The cost? Hundreds of thousands of dollars, an impossible sum for Isla to earn no matter how hard she worked. Since her father's tragic death in a work accident, Isla had become the sole provider for their small family. She worked 3 jobs, waitressing in the morning, assisting in an office in the afternoon, and cleaning at night. Yet, no matter how much effort she put in, her income barely covered daily expenses and her mother's temporary medications. That evening, after another exhausting shift, Isla was stopped outside her apartment by a group of unfamiliar men. "Isla Bennett, it's time to pay up," a deep, mocking voice echoed in the night. She looked up and recognized Tony Vargas, a notorious loan shark in the area. Months ago, she had borrowed $50,000 from him to cover her mother's hospital bills, thinking she could repay it over time. But the crushing interest had quickly spiraled the debt beyond her reach. "Tony, please, just give me a little more time," Isla pleaded, her voice trembling as she tried to remain composed. Tony smirked and motioned to one of his men, who stepped forward and tossed a stack of photographs onto the ground. Isla's heart pounded as she picked them up, images of her mother lying in a hospital bed, along with a notice of impending eviction from the hospital due to unpaid bills. "If you don't pay up by the end of the week," Tony's voice was laced with quiet menace, "I'm afraid your mother won't have a peaceful stay at the hospital." Fear gripped Isla's chest. She couldn't let that happen, but what could she do? Miles away, in a towering skyscraper, Damien Cross sat in his office chair, gazing out at the dazzling lights of New York City. But to him, the city was nothing more than a battlefield of numbers and power. 30 years old, Damien was the CEO of Cross Enterprises, one of the largest financial corporations in the country. He had everything: wealth, status, and the respect of the business world. Yet his family had a rigid rule: only married men who turned 31 were eligible to inherit the company. And Damien was running out of time. He didn't believe in love. To him, marriage was just another transaction. If he had to wed, he needed someone who wouldn't interfere with his life, someone easy to control, and most importantly, someone who wouldn't fall in love with him. His assistant had compiled a list of suitable candidates for him to consider, but none piqued his interest. That was until a small news article about a desperate young woman drowning in debt to save her mother caught his eye: Isla Bennett. Within a day, he had gathered every detail about her life. And when he saw her being harassed by loan sharks on the street, he made a decision. The meeting was set in a luxury hotel. Damien sat there, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, his sharp gaze assessing her from head to toe. "I know you're in trouble," he stated bluntly. "I have a proposal for you." Isla clenched her hands. "What kind of proposal?" "Marry me. For 1 year. In return, I'll pay off all your debts and cover your mother's medical expenses." Her breath hitched. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you joking?" Damien raised an eyebrow. "I never joke about business." A storm raged inside her. Was this her only way to save her mother? But at what cost? That night, Isla lay awake, torn apart by the impossible decision. She didn't want to sell herself, but if she refused, her mother would die. Tears streamed down her face as she finally picked up the pen and signed the contract. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it." Damien gave a curt nod. "Good. But there are conditions." She was not to interfere in his private life. She was not to expect affection. In public, they had to appear as the perfect couple. 1 week later, the wedding took place, a lavish spectacle that became the talk of the media. But to Isla, it felt like a surreal nightmare. That night, as they stepped into their grand mansion, Damien turned to her with a cold expression. "Don't forget," he murmured. "This is just a contract." Isla met his gaze, a dull ache settling in her chest. They were husband and wife in name only, but love had no place between them. From the moment she set foot in the Cross estate, Isla felt like an outsider in a foreign world. The estate was vast, its European-inspired architecture exuding elegance and prestige. Inside, every piece of furniture was meticulously placed. Every chandelier glistened flawlessly. Yet the very perfection of it all made the atmosphere feel unwelcoming and cold. She hadn't even had a chance to settle in when she came face to face with Evelyn Cross, Damien's mother. The older woman stood in the grand foyer, her sharp eyes scanning Isla like she was a cheap, unworthy product. "So, this is the girl my son chose to marry," Evelyn's voice dripped with disdain. Isla lowered her gaze, forcing herself to remain polite. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Cross." Evelyn crossed her arms, smirking. "I never knew my son had such humble tastes." Each word felt like a dagger to Isla's pride, but she held her tongue. Just then, Damien entered the room, his gaze indifferent as it swept over Isla. "Mother, I don't want any trouble." Evelyn scoffed. "Trouble? You married an unworthy woman and now expect me to welcome her with open arms?" Damien said nothing. He merely took Isla's hand and led her upstairs. As they ascended the grand staircase, Isla could still feel Evelyn's icy glare burning into her back. But her problems didn't end there. Aside from her mother-in-law's open hostility, Isla soon encountered another enemy, Camilla Frost, Damien's trusted assistant. Camilla was beautiful, sharp-witted, and always appeared flawless in front of Damien. From the very first day Isla stepped into the mansion, Camilla made her disdain clear. "You don't belong in this world, Isla," Camilla said with a smile, though her voice dripped with contempt. "Someone like you will never win his heart." Isla had no interest in winning Damien's heart. Their relationship was nothing more than a contract, and she had no intention of letting emotions get involved. But that didn't mean she would allow anyone to look down on her. "I don't need his heart," Isla replied calmly. "But I won't let you belittle me." Camilla raised an eyebrow, a glint of challenge in her eyes. "We'll see about that." Damien continued to walk past her as if she were nothing more than a shadow. Isla understood. She was just a wife in name only. But she refused to let herself break. She had made this choice and she had to see it through. One morning, Isla was in the mansion's library, flipping through some documents Damien had left on his desk. By chance, she spotted a crucial contract that was about to be signed. One of the clauses could bring significant losses to Cross Enterprises, yet it seemed like no one had noticed the risk. That afternoon, while Damien was in a board meeting, Isla walked in unexpectedly. "Can I have a moment with you?" she asked. Everyone in the room turned in surprise. Damien frowned but signaled for them to leave. Isla handed him the document. "Did you notice this clause? If you sign this deal, your company could suffer a major loss." Damien skimmed through the pages, his expression shifting. "How did you catch this?" he asked, sounding mildly impressed. Isla shrugged. "I have some experience reviewing contracts. I used to work as an office assistant." Damien was silent for a moment, then looked at her with new eyes. For the first time, he realized Isla wasn't as simple or useless as he had assumed. After that incident, his attitude toward her shifted slightly. He started paying more attention to her, sometimes letting his gaze linger a little longer, but he still kept his distance, as if afraid to let any emotion surface. Isla noticed, but didn't dwell on it. After all, they were just two strangers bound by a contract. Everything changed at a gala hosted by Cross Enterprises. Isla was expected to attend with Damien, so she did her best to play the role of the perfect wife, as their agreement required. But she never anticipated the disaster waiting for her. As she stood alone, one of Damien's business associates, Lucas Monroe, approached her. He was wealthy, but notorious for his womanizing ways. Lucas took her hand, leaning in too close. Isla quickly pulled away, but at that exact moment, Camilla appeared and gasped dramatically. "Isla, what are you doing?" All eyes turned to them. In front of the entire room, Camilla feigned shock. "You're really seducing Damien's business partner right here?" Isla froze. "I didn't do anything." But before she could explain, Damien appeared. His gaze was icy. "What are you doing, Isla?" His voice was devoid of emotion. Isla's heart clenched. Standing in the center of the grand ballroom, she felt the weight of everyone's judgment. She wanted to defend herself, to scream that she was innocent, but would anyone believe her? The one person who could stand by her side, the man she had unwillingly tied herself to, was now looking at her with cold indifference. "I didn't do anything," she said, forcing herself to stay calm. Camilla stepped closer, her expression full of mock concern. "Isla, if you wanted to flirt with someone, at least don't do it in front of Damien." The guests whispered among themselves. Lucas Monroe, the man truly at fault, simply smirked, not bothering to deny the accusation. Isla's throat burned with frustration. She couldn't stay there any longer. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the party. That realization hit Damien like a wave. Isla wasn't at fault. She had been set up. A deep sense of guilt washed over him. He had never truly cared about Isla's feelings. To him, she was just a temporary wife, someone who didn't matter. But when he recalled the hurt in her eyes before she left, he couldn't ignore the unfamiliar emotion creeping into his chest. He hated this feeling. Where had Isla gone? The next morning, Isla returned to the mansion, exhausted and drained. She didn't expect a warm welcome. But the moment she stepped inside, Evelyn Cross was already waiting, her piercing gaze filled with icy disdain. "You still dare to come back here?" Evelyn snapped. Isla remained silent. Evelyn scoffed. "You've disgraced this family. Do you think you can just stay here as if nothing happened?" Before Isla could say anything, a deep voice echoed from the staircase. "Mother!" Damien appeared, his gaze fixed on Isla. But this time there was no longer the usual coldness in his eyes. "Stop making things difficult for her." Evelyn froze. "Are you defending her?" Damien didn't respond. He simply walked up to Isla and said softly, "Go change your clothes. You'll catch a cold." Isla looked up, startled. This was the first time Damien had spoken to her with such gentleness. Nearby, Camilla clenched her fists. This was no longer the distant, indifferent Damien she knew. Every morning, instead of leaving coldly as he used to, Damien began asking if Isla wanted to accompany him to the company. After that incident, the relationship between Isla and Damien slowly shifted in a way neither of them had anticipated. One time, when Isla accidentally spilled coffee on his documents, instead of getting angry, he simply sighed and said, "Be more careful." A simple sentence, yet it made Isla's heart tremble. She reminded herself that this was just a contract. But why did these small moments between them feel so warm? One afternoon, Isla left the mansion to buy medicine for her mother. As she was crossing the street, a speeding car suddenly came rushing toward her. Everything happened too fast, the blaring horn, the screeching tires. She barely had time to turn before her body was flung onto the pavement. Voices shouted around her, but everything became blurry. She tried to keep her eyes open, but the world faded into darkness. When Isla woke up, the first thing she saw was the stark white ceiling of a hospital room. The second was Damien. He was sitting beside her, his shirt wrinkled, his expression filled with worry. The moment he saw her eyes open, he immediately stood up. His voice was hoarse. "Isla, are you okay?" She blinked, slightly startled. This was the first time she had seen him so shaken. I'm fine." Damien clenched his fists. "Do you have any idea how scared you made me?" Isla gazed at him, a strange emotion rising in her chest. Damien Cross, the man who always seemed so cold and indifferent, was worried about her. She didn't know how to feel about this. But there was one thing she did realize. He no longer saw her as just a contract wife. It was her mother's doctor. They had only met to discuss Margaret's condition. But someone had deliberately taken the photos from an angle that made it look like a romantic encounter. "Do you care to explain this?" a cold voice rang out. Isla looked up to see Evelyn Cross standing at the top of the stairs, her eyes filled with disdain. "You've pulled enough disgraceful stunts, and now you dare to cheat?" Isla clenched her fists. "This isn't what it looks like." Camilla scoffed. "Oh? Then what is it? Are you saying these pictures are just a coincidence?" Isla bit her lip, frustration and helplessness flooding her chest. They had never believed her. No matter what she said, they wouldn't listen. Hours later, Isla was summoned to the living room where Damien, Evelyn, and several family lawyers were already waiting. In front of them was a divorce agreement, Evelyn sat with her legs crossed, speaking in a calm yet cutting tone. I told you from the beginning this girl isn't worthy of you. And now she's proven it herself. She turned to Damien. Sign the divorce papers. Don't let the Cross family become a laughingstock. Isla's heart pounded as she looked at Damien. What would he say? After everything they'd been through, she had thought their relationship had changed. But now, as she stood on the brink of being cast out in humiliation, would Damien stand by her? The man remained silent. He didn't even look at her. His expression was dark and unreadable. She waited. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. But Damien still said nothing. Silence, more painful than any accusation. Isla felt her heart shatter. She had always known this marriage was just a contract. But deep down, she had hoped that at the very least, Damien would trust her. But he didn't. Taking a deep breath, Isla hid the hurt in her eyes. She understood now, this marriage had never meant anything to him. Back in her room, Isla opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. She started packing. She didn't want to stay here anymore. Contract was still in effect, but if Damien no longer trusted her, then staying meant nothing. Her mother had received treatment and was in stable condition. She no longer needed to cling to this marriage. Isla inhaled deeply. She would leave when the contract ended. This time she would walk away, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. Meanwhile, Damien couldn't sleep. All day, Isla's disappointed gaze haunted him. He had made a mistake. This feeling, it was the same as before when he had wrongly blamed her at the gala. But this time it was worse. Something wasn't right. Grabbing his phone, he called security. Send me all the surveillance footage from around the hotel that night. A few hours later, as he watched the video, the truth came to light. Isla had never cheated. She had only met with her mother's doctor. And Camilla. Camilla was the one who had sent the photos to the press, deliberately twisting the truth. Rage burned in Damien's eyes. She dared to do this? He didn't hesitate. He would protect Isla, even if it meant going against his family, or the entire world. Even though she had fallen for Damien, if he didn't truly love her, then none of this mattered. She would still leave. Isla walked out of Damien's mansion that very day. She didn't need anyone's pity. Even though she loved him, if his love was only born from guilt or responsibility, then it was meaningless. Isla chose to leave. In the days that followed, she returned to her normal life. She found a small apartment and resumed her work at a local publishing house. But not a day passed without her thinking of Damien. She told herself she had made the right decision, yet her heart ached every time she thought of him. And Damien? He wasn't doing any better. The mansion felt colder than ever, silent dinners, sleepless nights, and an empty house. For the first time in his life, he realized he had lost something truly important. And it wasn't his inheritance. It was Isla. Damien couldn't accept it. He needed her back, not as a contract wife, but as the woman he loved. One evening, Damien stood before his mother. "Mother," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I'm going to marry Isla." Evelyn Cross stared at him, stunned. "What are you saying? Contract is over. You don't have to take responsibility anymore." Damien shook his head. "This isn't about responsibility." He looked up, his voice firm. "I love her." Evelyn's face went pale. "She's not worthy of you." Damien let out a quiet chuckle. "Then I guess I'm not worthy of this family either." Evelyn froze as her son placed a document on the table. A renunciation of inheritance. "If you can't accept Isla, then I don't need any of this." Evelyn was speechless. She had never imagined that Damien would be willing to give up everything for a woman. No matter how much she objected, she knew she had lost. For the first time in her life, she saw unwavering determination in her son's eyes. One afternoon, as Isla stepped out of her office after work, she was startled to see a familiar car parked in front of the building. The door opened. Damien stepped out. Isla froze. Her heart pounded at the sight of him. He looked the same, yet different. More exhausted, as if he hadn't slept properly in days. Damien walked up to her, his gaze filled with sincerity. He didn't say a word at first. Instead, he slowly took out a small box and opened it. Inside was a sparkling ring. But this time there was no contract. No conditions. Only a man in love with a woman. I took too long to realize this, Damien said softly, his voice slightly trembling. Isla, I can't live without you. Marry me this time for love. Isla looked at the ring, then at him. Tears welled up in her eyes. How long had she waited for this moment? How long had she longed to hear these words from him? But this time, she didn't have to doubt. 'Cause Damien had already proven it. Through his actions. He had chosen her, over his family, over his inheritance, over everything else. A laugh escaped Isla through her tears. She nodded. Yes. Damien let out a relieved breath before pulling her into his arms, holding her tightly. She was back with him. This time not because of a contract, but because of real love. Meanwhile, Camilla Frost couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. After being fired from Cross Enterprises, she was also sued for deliberately spreading false rumors. Her career was completely ruined. As for Evelyn Cross, though she hadn't fully accepted Isla, she no longer opposed their relationship. Because when she saw her son truly happy, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she could no longer control Damien's heart. 1 month later, Isla Bennett and Damien Cross held their official wedding ceremony on a breathtaking beach. No contracts. No business transactions. Just two people in love, ready to spend a lifetime together. As Damien held Isla's hand and looked at her in her stunning white wedding dress, he knew this was the best decision of his life. Cherry Blossom, thank you for taking the time to enjoy this story. If you liked it, don't forget to hit like, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories. Sparkling Heart.